Hello, today we're going to paint some daffodils in watercolor and ink. So I'm starting off with some watercolors first, followed by a little bit of pen and then watercolors again. The brushes that I'm using here are round pointed brush size 10 and 12. So let's start off with brush number 12, which is slightly larger than size 10. I'm going to mix some yellow. I'm using Winsor yellow and a tiny bit of cadmium yellow. I really did not want the cadmium yellow on its own and wanted a little bit more lighter wash, which is why I mixed two yellows. And you can see it's a very watery mixture right now, and I'm beginning by painting very simple petal shapes on the paper. While the wash is still wet, I'm going to drop in some cadmium yellow into that wash. Just let it spread naturally. And now let's do this. That's the center part of the flower, which is orange. I'm using Winsor orange. And just again dropping in some bits in the center. Now for the second flower, which is underneath it, I'm starting off with the orange in the center. So again, Winsor orange, and this time it's not very watery because I have water surrounding it, so just use the tip of my brush to put some paint over there. And now let's finish the petals off. It's okay if the petals touch each other and create an uneven shape. We can always come back to it and fix it, or even do an extra layer to bring the flower out. So where there is a lot of petals covering the area, I'm going to be a little bit extra careful. Now let's move on to the next set of flowers. Let's try these buds. So they're quite small, they're not quite open yet, so the shape is going to be very different. So let's try that now. So I'm starting off with the tip of the brush again. Very quick movement for the half open buds. They are not as large as the first ones that we did. So quick rough shapes just to give the impression of the buds that we see here. I'd like to paint a couple more flowers to create a bunch of flowers. So let's start with the next couple of flowers. So I'm quickly just arranging to see how it goes on the paper, and then I'm going to do the same process again, starting off with a watery yellow wash. So I have been using Winsor yellow and a little bit of cadmium yellow. So not quite just the cadmium yellow, I've got a bit of lighter Winsor yellow as well. The way the flowers are kept here is slightly different. They're not fully opened. We are seeing it from the side, so you can see the petals are slightly different. They're not wide open and full petals. So just trying to get the shape of what I'm seeing here. I'm not really thinking of them as petals at the moment, just getting the shape of what I'm seeing here. So it looks quite abstract now, and that's fine. So now I'm changing into the smaller brush because I like to do the stem, and for this I'm using size 10 brush. Green is olive green, and for the stem it's just going to be one quick movement downwards. Again, I'm only using the tip of my brush. Now I'd like to add a little bit more details into these flowers. So I'm looking at the off-white section of the stem that is sticking out, and that bit is called spathe. And for the spathe I'm using a different color. Here I know the real color is off-white, but I'm using a little bit of ultramarine blue with the leftover pigment of green from the stem, just to bring that shape out, make it stand out and look more interesting. And while it's still wet, I can go back into the stem, add some more green, and this time when I'm doing the green, I don't need a lot of water, just take some pigment straight away from the pan and drop in the pigment into the wet area where you need a little bit more color for the stem. I know at this stage it looks quite pale, and now you can build in and give it some more color. Let's add the spath to the other two stems as well. So again, very little bit of ultramarine blue on the tip of my brush. I've already got green on the stem, so all I need to do is just create that shape. You can see it's very watery, very light. There's not a lot of pigment in there, so it looks quite interesting that way, I feel. So let's do the last stem. So again, starting off with the green. So it's really a repetition of what we did so far. We're starting off with the green and pull a stem down, and then you can add the spath in, and we're done with our first wash. After this, I'm going to leave this to dry completely, or if you're in a hurry, you can always use a little bit of hairdryer, but make sure that the heat setting is set to very mild, so it doesn't affect your watercolors. Once the sketch is completely dry, I can now add on some ink, and the ink that I'm using here is Sketch ink by Roher and Klinger, and it's not black, it's a blackish green color, and I feel that it could go better with the bright yellow flowers rather than a black ink. And for the pen, I'm using my mapping pen, which is a dip pen with a very fine nib. I really love the way the pen works on paper with the thick and thin lines that I can create. So let's start with the first set of flowers. I'm going to start with the middle of the flower. I'm trying not to contour the flower, but I like to add some value using lines. So I'm starting with the center where there's a lot more details. I don't need to add each and every line. I can choose which one I want to add, and when I choose, I usually look for the darker areas. Now let's move on to some petals. Again, it doesn't have to be a clean line. You can just create some very loose lines just to create the impression of the petals. Let me continue with the next flower, and again for the next one I start with the center again, adding some details in the center, maybe the suggestion of some petals. Now for the buds, again I'm going to add a few petals, not really contouring but maybe highlighting some petals, bringing out the details of only a few of them. I can be very scribbly, my lines can be really loose and expressive. I'm now done with adding lines onto my floral illustration. Now I'm going to go back into some watercolor to add a second layer just to show the depth in each petals. So I'm starting off with the first set of flowers. I can observe the dark and light on the petal and add some depth into each petal. So I'm starting off with a little bit of cadmium yellow, and I can also add a tiny bit of ultramarine blue. I need to be very careful and make sure that I'm not mixing cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, because I might get a very green color. So what you can do is you can add a very light wash of ultramarine blue over the cadmium yellow petals, and you can see that the yellow shines through as well, giving it a very translucent look, which is very special with watercolors. So here I'm just adding the shadows, like how I can see in the flower, and I'm being very careful not to be too strong with the blue color, because if I am, then I would lose the yellow color, the bright yellow of the flower. But at the same time, I like a little bit of shadow in there just to show depth. I'm now going to add some blue, or the shadow color, to the flower underneath the first one, and here you can see that it's a bit more darker because that flower is in the shadow of the first flower. So I'm adding a little bit more blue here, but then again being really careful that I'm not overpowering it. So a quick wash should be fine. The more pigments and the more brush strokes we add, you would lose the simplicity of these petals. Hope you enjoyed the process. All the materials used and the pigments used are explained in the description below. Please feel free to get in touch if you do have any questions. Happy painting!